Hello and welcome to Visible Voices. The Visible Project is a Leeds-based initiative aimed at improving the outcomes of adults that have experienced any form of childhood sexual abuse. The Visible Project is made up of two equally important groups. The Strategic Steering Group, which consists of both statutory and voluntary organisations within Leeds, and the Visible Leadership Reference Group. This podcast is by the Visible Leadership Reference Group, which consists of people who have experienced any form of childhood sexual abuse, otherwise known as CSA survivors. Names may or may not be used throughout this series.
Welcome, Tess. Could you introduce yourself, who you are, what organisation you come from, and then lead into how you're involved with Visible?
My name's Tessa Denham. I'm the Chief Exec at Women's Counselling and Therapy Service here in Leeds. And how we became involved with Visible is we were one of the founders. Visible is currently hosted by us, but back in 2015, when the Saville report came out, we hosted a workshop that was across Leeds to talk about what the report and what we were learning from it meant for Leeds. And from that, Visible was set up really with the support of some visionary and really ethical responses from commissioners in the NHS. So Visible's been around for eight years now, and we were there at the beginning.
And when you started those conversations, what did you hope to achieve with Visible?
Well, I think the name was an interesting discussion, how we chose the name. And I think we were wanting to make this human experience, this issue of child sexual abuse, this crime, we wanted to make it more visible. I mean, I think we forget where we are now, but prior to really the Saville investigation and inquiry, child sexual abuse was really invisible in society. It was visible to those who experienced it and those predominantly in families who experienced it, but the rest was completely invisible. It was invisible to statutory organisations, to the police. There was a report that came out a couple of years after the Saville report, but it was from the inquiry into child sexual abuse, and it was called something like deflection, denial, and disbelief. And that was the theme around child sexual abuse in society, in British society at that time, that it was either deflected away and really made into bad children, bad young women. It was denied, it didn't happen, or it was disbelieved. So I think it's difficult to realise now when we have somebody like Simone Biles competing, it makes me cry, competing in the Olympics today as a really visible child sexual abuse survivor from her coach, along with a number of others in the American gymnastics team. It's difficult to realise today that 10 years ago, this issue was invisible. So that's what we were hoping, that it became visible, and therefore the needs of survivors could be seen, understood, and start to be met.
Touching on one of the things that you said there, I'll raise it, that you said about the Olympics, that you were saying how it's become visible, but yet I feel that there's still areas that need to be improved, areas that we need to work on, given that the Dutch volleyball player is a convicted child rapist who's been allowed to play.
Yeah, I was surprised. I was shocked when I saw that in the news a couple of days ago. I suppose you're a tireless campaigner, so absolutely, I see that you would want more to be done, and I'm with you. Me too. A part of me says that this person was convicted and served his time, and we live in society where you can be rehabilitated. My perspective is, what about the young person, the young woman? And this is a lifelong consequence. Being abused as a child is a lifelong consequence, or can be, or often is. I think 10 years ago, that wouldn't even be named in the press. So I think it is more visible, but I was surprised. I still think it's a very, very difficult issue to talk about in society. I think the horror of child sexual abuse is very difficult for us to face. I think it's still very much a gendered issue. So in comes, sexual discrimination comes in here around the power of women and girls to speak out. And I know a lot of abused people are male as well. So there is more to be done. You're right, and I'm with you. I am heartened by what's happened in the last sort of 8 years. That's all it is, 6 to 8 years. I hope it'll keep going as it has. Hope the changes will keep we'll keep going. But yes, there's more to be done.
I think for me, one of the things that, yes, I am pleased that we are talking more about the subject and raising the awareness and things. But I think for me, what's still a big area that needs to be discussed that we don't really talk about is, like you said, the impacts that it has on somebody who's had that experience. I've been quite surprised when I'm reading about things like trauma-informed practice and things about the Olympics and that kind of thing, how little people actually know about the impact that it has on the person who's had that experience, and that long-term impact is not something that just happens in childhood. It's something that continues into adulthood and can stay with you. You can't eradicate that experience. That experience will imprint on you lifelong.
It will. In one of the inquiry's reports, there was a really good table where it set out the consequences and the impacts of abuse. I can't recall it now, but it was from potential physical damage all the way to an impact on your spiritual life, your relationship with God or another faith, impacts on education, on relationships, on work, on every aspect of life. And it can have, and often does have, a lifelong impact. Now, it's a tricky one to talk about impact, isn't it? Because we know from trauma and trauma-informed care that we experience things differently depending on who we are as individuals, depending on the response at the time, depending on support we've had since, depending on our culture, our background. And I think some people would absolutely say that they have fully recovered from child sexual abuse. And then a lot of us would say that's not, we're never going to fully recover. I mean, I think, as you know, I'm a survivor of child sexual abuse, and I don't know that I will ever get back I don't want to get upset, but my sort of God-given right to trust people. I think, we come into the world trusting people, and having that severe betrayal, and in my case, it was 2 male family members, I don't trust as I think I did before I was abused. So yeah, I think it can be lifelong. And some people, suffer with lifelong physical damage, a lot of people. But alongside that, a lot of people suffer in relationships. And our relationships are everywhere, aren't they? They're in our families, they're in our birth families, our new families, our education, our work. We live life in relationships. And child sexual abuse impacts our capacity and our ability to engage in effective to intimate relationships. So yeah, that's me anyway.
And the relationship with yourself, that's the hugest impact that it has on. From my experience, totally, that I became very hateful and hated myself. And yes, I agree about trust of others and the world seemed unsafe. But as a person, I couldn't tolerate the person that I was. So and I think things like when we say that it impacts on trust and things like that, I think we need to have, like you say, more wider discussions, because some people don't understand, or they just don't trust people, or, they're a bit cautious, or might think that in a relationship they're going to get cheated on, or this, that, and other. I think sometimes now we need to take that step forward and talk about the reality that such experiences have on a person.
It's a really good point, Debbie. That is our first relationship, isn't it? In some ways, with ourselves and our inner thoughts or our feelings or our attitudes towards ourselves. And yeah, absolutely has a profound effect on that. I think partly because it is often internalized that does happen in secret. If and when people do find out, often the response is not a good one. And I think you can take that inside, can't you? And it becomes, yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, crap, eh?
Yeah, definitely. And I think, like you say, we've come so far in putting it out there and being able to talk about it. Now it's taking that step further. And what's the narrative now? Once we've brought it out saying this happens and we can't put it under the carpet anymore, what's the next narrative we need to be getting out there to bust some myths and give that reality?
I'm quite philosophical. I used to be much more of a radical campaigner, but these days I'm a bit more philosophical. And I think it takes time. I think it takes time, and maybe it takes some real activists like yourself to really push the agenda forward. I think it's also different for younger people who are growing up in a different environment than maybe you and I grew up in around sexual abuse. It's hopefully these days it's much more thought about in terms of young people who may be exhibiting some signs or symptoms or difficulties, that it's thought about as a possibility. Hopefully the first people who speak to young people are much better at speaking to young people. And in adult services, the work that Visible's doing is vital in helping services understand more about how they need to sort of just slightly adjust their practice to support people who have difficulties accessing health services. Certainly things around dentists, I think is a big thing sometimes for some sexual abuse survivors. Things like for women, I think pap smears are really, can be really difficult to even make an appointment, let alone attend, let alone go in the cubicle, let alone for it to be a successful. So I think, but there would just be small changes that could make things so much easier. Labour and birth.
Picking up on something that you've said, I recently did a talk to the continence, urology and colorectal community team and the group of nurses there. And for two reasons. One, that what isn't often talked about is that people who have experienced child sexual abuse may have physical difficulties with that area of their body and those functions because of damage that's caused when they're young, but also that it is that part of the body. So it comes from two areas. Not everybody has the physical issues or physical conditions that's changed. I do. I've had to have an operation on my bladder nerves because they were damaged from when I was little. But also there's those people who are just that, like you say, that being touched, that area of the body, that anxiety of being another person looking at them and all those kind of things. So there's, for me, in accessing health services, there's two routes in that might be an issue. But one of the things that you've said, which I think some people, and I know I've come across people have said, why might there be an issue with dentists?
Right. Are you asking me that?
Yeah, yeah. Why do you think there's an issue with
I
dentists?
think it's about, I don't know, and I don't know if there's any research on it, but I think it's something about control. There can be something about sort of being in a powerless sort of physical position. You're lying down. I would imagine there's also for some people oral trauma where abuse has taken a place round the mouth. So I think it's a number of things, but it's also something around. I wonder if there's something around the possibility of pain. Not severe pain, because obviously dentists control pain really well, but the concern about having sort of some being in a powerless position and feeling pain potentially. I mean, I think it's across the whole population that there is some anxiety around dentists. I think it's probably heightened for those of us who have had either trauma to our mouths or trauma to our bodies, by another person. Sort of, the position as well. A dentist is very sort of over you. So I would imagine it's a number of things, but I don't think we think in detail. And I think we don't like to think in detail because it's very difficult to, it's a very difficult subject to engage with. Just then, when you were talking, I don't think we have a phrase that says genital trauma. Just as you were thinking, those were the words
Yeah.
that was coming to my. But that is a very specific experience. So we don't ask in screening tests, have you ever had any genital trauma or anything like that, do we? But that could be it would be something that the team you're talking about and talking to, if they could just ask as part of their screening, would open the door to somebody making a choice to say yes or no, disclosing or not. Things like that we're not great as a society. Like we don't ask a general question, I think, around healthcare. Have you ever had any physical trauma that I should be aware of? That is something that we could get a lot better at accepting the reality of a lot of people's experience of physical trauma or violence and as children, and child sexual abuse is part of that. Yeah.
We look at the service that you run, and would you like to describe what the service is you run, what it offers to people, and how people access that service?
So Women's Counselling and Therapy has been active in Leeds for over 40 years now. We offer a counselling and psychotherapy, really, with some support around wider social and healthcare needs alongside, but really counselling and psychotherapy. We have capacity to work with about 450 women and girls every year. We work with 16-year-olds upwards. We are massively, as most counselling and therapy services, oversubscribed. So our waiting lists are closed a lot of the time because we try and manage the wait. So the wait isn't more than 3 to 6 months because research shows that being on a waiting list for a long time can impact your mental health negatively. Women on average work with us for about 20 sessions over about an 8-month period, some much shorter and some much longer. And we have a general service open to any Leeds-based 16-year-old young woman upwards. And then we have some specialist services. So we have a perinatal mental health service. We have a particular group who work with 16 to 25-year-old young women. We've got some funding at the moment to work with women who have severe impact from COVID. And so we have a range of funding. And we're part of the Leeds Mental Wellbeing Service. We're offering them some waiting list support at the moment to bring down waiting lists there. We operate from Leeds city centre, which is sort of, we say, one bus ride from anywhere, and some community venues around Leeds, particularly in deprived areas of deprivation in Leeds.
And is that self-referral, or does that referral come from other professionals?
So we encourage self-referral, so people are actually actively choosing to come to counselling. But we take professional referrals as well. At the moment, it's about 2/3 self and 1/3 professional, partly because we really work with professionals, not for them to do the referral, for them to support people to do the referral themselves. It's quite important in opting into counselling that you've chosen to come. You've decided to come and do this because it's difficult work. It's difficult work exploring, your thoughts and feelings and behaviour and your difficulties, and thinking about the pain that often brings people to counselling is difficult work.
What barriers are there that you encounter to support those adults that have experienced child sexual abuse?
For us, we would like a lot more capacity to work with the women and girls who need us. It would be great in Leeds if there was a service that focused on male survivors of child sexual abuse. There is a West Yorkshire one, Survivors UK. It'd be good if there was more of a Leeds capacity. But I think more broadly, I think there is a real challenge around long-term support. A lot of the NHS offered talking therapies are short-term, 6 to 12 sessions, at the maximum, say 20. And working with issues that started in childhood and that are often can be around trust and relationship, you need longer-term support. Many people need much longer-term support. People argue that it costs a lot to offer long-term support, and it does. However, I would argue that there's an even greater cost to the economy, greater cost in terms of a loss to the economy, let alone the moral argument for addressing this in society. So actually, I think the financial argument, I get the financial argument, but I think it's one side, because we're not looking at the benefits that would bring to society to have many more people more able to sort of transform their challenges and be much more active participants in society. A lot of us, I think, really struggle to meet anything like our full potential and what we could offer in society because of the impacts and consequences of the experience. So I think we should offer long-term support.
Thank you for listening to this episode. We hope you found Visible Voices interesting, thought-provoking, and helpful. If you have any ideas about how we can improve the podcast to make it more useful to your service, please feel free to contact us. Visible Voices was created and delivered by the Visible Leadership Reference Group. The podcast's production was facilitated by Western Studios Leeds Limited, and the music was created and produced by Mark Parvin, aka Marvin Parks. You can follow Visible on Twitter and Facebook. If the content of this podcast has affected you and you live in Leeds, please go to the child abuse subsection of the Mindwell website. That's mindwell-leeds.org.uk.